The purpose of debate is to prepare students to become informed policymakers. Thus, we should only be evaluating impacts on things that will occur in the future. Second, fairness. The IMF is an international organization that has consistently evolved. Evaluating the IMF into the future is much more debatable and more productive. Condition 1, economic growth. IMF loan programs intend to alleviate economic downturns and help support the recovery of countries facing economic crisis for two main reasons. First, conditions attached to the IMF loans protect the investment and ensure that it is invested with the best possible outcome. Two, the second, improve the creditworthiness of a country, which has a positive signaling effect that leads to more investment in aid. Kirkwood found that the IMF's engagement is a positive signal to financial markets that provides countries with important time and maneuvering room to overcome crisis. Therefore, it boosts the GDP. Hackler found in 2019 that satisfying the IMF's condition correlates with an average GDP growth rate of 1.27%. Average GDP growth rate for those countries saw a significant increase. Other researchers choose that the IMF loans were effective in boosting the economy and increasing the GDP growth rate. Mukherjee found in 2008 conducted a simple analysis to assess the effect of aid and loans from the IMF on economic growth and infant mortality for more than 110 developing countries. The mean growth rate among those who receive financial help from the IMF is 2 times higher than the mean growth rate among the autocracies. The first impact is reducing poverty. Economic growth is the most powerful instrument for reducing poverty and improving the quality of life. On average, a 1% increase in per capita income reduced poverty by 1.7%. The poverty link between growth and poverty reduction is clear. The second impact is decreasing income inequality. Bird found in 2020 that IMF programs independently affect inequality. In the years following the signing of a program, income inequality is significantly lower, the decline of almost 18%. Condition 2, coronavirus solvency. Without assistance from the IMF, millions will lose their lives as countries face economic shocks and public health crisis. William Grutt reported in 2020 that the world economy contracted 4.5%, with a loss of 255 million full-time jobs. The IMF states that COVID could reverse 30 years of progress made fighting global poverty, and as 90 million people could be plunged beneath into extreme poverty. The IMF offers a solution that effectively solved this problem. Gallagher found in 2020 that the IMF has shown through the coronavirus that they have learned and adapted to be far less conditioned on austerity and has prioritized health expenditure and social spending to attack the coronavirus and protect the vulnerable. The IMF is not conditioning its emergency relief on draconian austerity measures. The IMF is resolving the economic crisis with a multidimensional approach. Impact, saving lives. The fund has temporarily doubled the access to its emergency facilities. The IMF scores a 2.39 out of 3 for encouraging health spending and increasing the supply of medical devices. The World Health Organization estimates a 1% increase in health spending will save over 60 million lives a year. Under COVID, these impacts are even greater, saving up to 90 million lives each year. Condition 3, climate change. The IMF has new commitment to environmental protection and against climate change. Fiona Harvey found in 2021 that Kristalina Georgieva, the head of the International Monetary Fund, has said that the IMF stood ready to help countries decarbonize their economies with the goal of reaching net zero emissions by mid-century. The two ways the IMF would help the situation. First, its a climate plan will reduce emissions. Hawkins found in 2020 that the IMF's proposed involves an 80% subsidy rate for renewable energy production, calibrated to achieve an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050, taken through public projects. Green recovery plans will be reflected in IMF-supported programs. Reforms include public investment projects focused on boosting climate-smart technologies. Impact 1, saves lives. Rachel Rentner found in 2019 that the climate change will lead to 250,000 additional deaths each year between 2030 and 2050. We save these people by eliminating this issue of climate change and by using renewable energy. Secondly, we save money and resources. Researchers from Harvard University have found that energy efficiency measures can save a region up to $210 million annually. It ties back to our economic growth argument. Green initiatives are key to sustainable economic growth in the long term. Based on these reasons, we strongly affirm.
Can you send your contention 3 in the Gmail?
Sorry, Judge, should it be time for our neg case to begin?
Yeah, so, but we're just waiting for y'all to send your third contention.
Yeah, if...
Just to make clear, we're not allowed to prep during evidence check.
We aren't prepping, we're just waiting for you to send your third contention in the email chain.
Okay.
Do you want like a screenshot?
Like just copy and paste that part of your case into the Gmail and send it.
You got it, Sunny?
We're gonna wait until. Oh, sorry.
I just sent it, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, please check. Did you reply all, Sunny?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Perfect.
Okay.
Is everyone ready? Okay. And to clarify, Judge, I'm Sydney Vance speaking first for Marist. All right. Claire and I negate, and our first contention is austerity. Even in the midst of the pandemic, the IMF is enacting austerity, as Ambrose explains that emergency loans the IMF distributed contain commitments to austerity programs as soon as the immediate health crisis peaked, with little provisions for any recovery period. These commitments will reduce and freeze public sector wages and constrain public spending during what would otherwise be country's economic recovery period. These austerity measures rely upon privatizing key sectors, and in the middle of a pandemic, this ensures disaster. As Court wrote in 2020, that in the middle of a pandemic, it could weaken domestic markets and be a greater gateway to corruption and cronyism. This means that the poor will increasingly bear the brunt of the pandemic and its aftermath. The chances of yielding success by re-implementing IMF reforms are slim. This is harmful for two reasons. The first is for social safety net programs, as Therault quantifies that over 80% of IMF COVID-19 loans push for belt tightening that can result in deep cuts to public healthcare spending and social protection. This austerity will hurt countries and worsen poverty and inequality, as countries which receive loans are being encouraged to roll back social protections in place. That's problematic, as the World Bank quantifies that 36% of the very poor escape extreme poverty because of social safety nets. Social safety nets lower inequality and reduce the poverty gap by 45%. But second is that it increases civil conflict. As Detras explains, the IMF programs create economic grievances and frustration, especially among such disadvantaged groups, because they disproportionately feel the impact of structural adjustment programs. Perceived economic disadvantage produces fear, anger, and frustration, and this growing resentment will result in a greater likelihood of violence. There is also substantial evidence that IMF programs might contribute to the rise of repression, such as political arrests, censorships, and killing, and such instabilities create more incentives for the government to pursue repressive policies and eliminate domestic instabilities to restore order. There are two empirical examples of this. First is in Rwanda, as Grauman explains that cuts in social spending increase grievances in the population, making insurgency more attractive. The provision of public goods is essential for government function, and restricting this function with spending cuts contributed to higher levels of social unrest, which is why in Rwanda, cuts in public goods helped exacerbate the already tense situation. But second is Uganda, as Grauman explains that reductions in military spending decrease a state's ability to suppress armed uprisings. The IMF supported programs that accounted for an 11% decrease in military spending since the end of the Cold War. If a state is confronting a legitimate security threat, this emphasis on military cuts is illogical. For example, in 1987, the IMF implemented an adjustment program in Uganda. At the time, the country had been involved in an armed civil conflict since 1981. As a result of these cuts, the Ugandan army was not able to suppress the insurgency, and conflict continued, which is why Feng indicates in 2020 that the region remains prone to conflict, with around 30% of countries affected in 2019. But there are two impacts, and the first is economic growth. As Feng continues that in sub-Saharan Africa, the annual growth in countries in conflict is 25 or 2.5 percentage points lower, and the cumulative impact on GDP increases over time. That's problematic, as Moser explains that economic growth has been at the core of poverty reduction in sub-Saharan Africa. A 10% increase in GDP leads to a 1% increase in life expectancy, 4% decline in infant mortality, and 4% increase in school enrollment. But the second impact is death, as D writes in 1 year alone, 35,000 people died in conflict in sub-Saharan Africa. Contention 2 is agriculture. The IMF forces agricultural liberalization as Sonkin argues in 2020 that 43% of IMF loan programs include food and agricultural conditions that make the majority of its interventions constitute a push for the liberalization of the sector, reducing the role of the state as a provider of price supports, insurance, and other things. The problem is that this high exposure to food systems makes the market extremely volatile and increases their inclination to shocks. This empirically has led to crisis and famine, as Shaoji explains, that this was imposed on Africa and Latin America, which through social adjustment programs contributed to lost decades as agricultural producers in developing countries faced widespread market failures. Specifically, Chandra writes that a good example is in Zambia, as the IMF required the government to eliminate subsidies, prices skyrocketed, forcing 7 million people into poverty. The impact is massive, particularly troubling now, as the OCHA writes that nearly 690 million people were undernourished in 2019 as a result. Are y'all ready for cross, or do you need to see any cards?
Yeah, can we check your card on agricultural liberalization and about the damages of that, and also the first card for contention 1 about the conflicts in Rwanda caused by the IMF? Just those two email chains? That'd be great, yeah.
Okay, so the first card that I sent is, or I sent them both in the same email. The first, oops, sorry, I'm trying to get it to send. Okay, the first card is that the IMF led to other countries' agricultural sectors having to be liberalized, and then the second is the Rwanda empiric.
Yeah, I don't see it yet. Might be loading over.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, yeah, we'll wait until we get that.
Okay.
Oh, all right, cool. Thank you. Got those. Cool.
All right, you can have first question.
Okay. How many countries after receiving IMF actually experience privatization? And how many actually leads to silver conflicts?
Yeah, so all the countries that took IMF loans, like that specifically took the IMF loans that the IMF gave out during COVID, had to receive austerity measures. So we're saying that all of those countries that received IMF COVID-19 loans had privatization because IMF austerity programs forced privatization.
Then how many of them suffer from like silver conflicts? Because you only gave one example of Rwanda.
Yeah, it's two examples. Yeah, it's two examples. We give you Rwanda and we give you Uganda. We're just saying that the privatization overall increases the likelihood of conflict because when less people have access to social programs and those types of spending, it increases frustration and strain on the economy, which makes people more likely to revolt. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. On C3 about climate change, has the IMF policy for climate change been passed?
Green recovery plans that have been passed.
So what you read in case is that the IMF is proposing these green recovery plans. That's not the same as the IMF has passed them.
No. In the past, they have had carbon taxation, and then they're providing renewable energy production, and they're continuing to stick with these goals and actions in the past. And they're going to continue to do that in the future with the goal of reaching net zero emissions.
Okay, so that's the plan. Like you just read out the plan, but that has not been enacted, but you can have a question.
Okay, my follow-up to your about like silver conflicts. You never provide like the number of like how much IMF will actually lead to that. Okay, like because what do you say? This sounds like slippery slope argument. You name 2 cases, but then we have a card tells you that out of 97 events, only 5 occurred in the same year.
Sure. The problem is that we're saying that if there is any risk that IMF austerity measures can lead to increasing in civil conflict, that is problematic because it increases. As a result, we've seen that conflict in sub-Saharan Africa has increased overall by 30%. But a big problem with your cases is that not one example do you give as to how the IMF has lifted a country out of poverty. Like, all of your examples are just net why the IMF may be good, but you don't give any terminalized examples of what country the IMF has lifted out of poverty due to economic growth, what country has seen these rollbacks in poverty due to like COVID solvencies.
Okay, well, we're telling you in that piece that we have to look at the trend of like 100, like all the more than 100 developing countries the IMF have helped, and we summarize the trends of these countries. If you want to name,
what countries are those? That's my question. What are those countries?
Yeah, like Vietnam, like also Namibia and Tunisia. Like there are a lot of countries, developing countries that receive help from the IMF. What we're seeing is that we're summarizing the trends the IMF has helped, and we're not like signaling out any individual countries and using them as cases.
Okay, that's cross.
Are y'all taking prep for first rebuttal?
No, I think we're all good. All right. Is everybody ready? Judges ready? Opponents ready? Opponents ready? All right. My time will begin now. Judge, before anything begins, we tell you that our meta-analysis on economic growth is the most comprehensive with 80 years of history that empirically proves the economy is growing. And my partner has shown you that it is possible through three things: advice, conditionality, and also creditworthiness. Now I go into their case. First, austerity no longer exists. In fact, according to Brookings, of the $88 billion financed into COVID, 84% had no austerity measures because of reform. Aside from 13 programs, there are no strings attached to the liquidity provision. Judge, according to Brookings and Gallagher 2020, the IMF is promoting inclusive growth with no austerity tied to it. They are telling you evidence that is not related. Now, second, Judge, we tell you that austerity only occurs in the short term. Although IMF loans with public sector conditions prompt cuts to the wage bill in the short term, our results suggest that such cuts may only be temporary. Using an error correction model, we estimate the short and long-term effects of adding a public sector condition to an IMF program, which actually shows that in the long term, these fiscal measures promote growth. So even if we admit austerity did occur in the past, these measures actually create stability, which in turn create long-term economic growth, as stated by my first speaker, Sunny. Now, moving on, Judge, we actually give you concrete evidence of why social spending is actually increasing around the world. We tell you, according to Clements et al. 2013, that controlling for all other detriments, IMF-supported programs have a positive and significant effect on social spending in low-income countries. Judge, this takes away both their links and turns their entire argument onto our side, because not only do we prove economic growth, we also prove an increase in social spending. In fact, over a 5-year period, not only does GDP grow 3/4%, the health spending increases by 1% of GDP, which means that in real per capita terms, there is a 3% increase in education spending and 3% increase in health spending. Judge, we take away their entire case about austerity. Now, Judge, let's move on to their second contention about their link about civil war. Judge, we tell you that unfortunately, their explanation of the connection is neither grounding well in theories explaining who wins or who loses from liberalization. In fact, we tell you that out of total of 97 events where a country experienced both economic crisis and signed an economic program by the IMF, only 5 had a civil war ever occurring. Their only argument in the crossfire is saying that if there's a possibility it might occur, this is bad. We tell you it almost never happens according to empirical evidence. Prefer our side because of empirics. Now, Judge, lastly, we even tell you a link turn that actually the IMF improves government transparency and actually prevents autocracies from happening that create civil war, according to Lundgren et al. 13. We tell you that the international community from the IMF actually increases transparency, which actually decreases civil conflict, taking away from their link to their austerity argument. Now, Judge, finally, moving on to the case about agricultural liberalization, Judge, we give you one of the most prominent examples of Vietnam, in which its journey lifted 40 million people out of poverty from 1993 to 2014, precisely because of the IMF. But don't listen to me. Listen to the expert of the Central Institute for Economic Management for Vietnam, which says that cooperation with the IMF has been very, very important for the whole process of reform. Judge, precisely because of two things. First, the liberalization of the agricultural sector actually stabilized the economy, which meant easing price controls, raising interest rates, and limiting subsidies to efficient state-owned enterprises. What this shows you is that we actually increase efficiency by privatization, and it's exactly this privatization of agriculture that has decreased inflation and increased the people brought out of poverty. In fact, the poverty rate in that time span with the IMF actually decreased almost 60%, precisely because of privatization of agriculture. Judge, our evidence comes from one of the most prominent examples of the only IMF in the world, and actually takes away from their very argument. Thus, Judge, we not only prove through links, but also impact that their contention one of austerity does not stand, their link of civil war does not stand, and lastly, their contention two of agricultural liberalization does not cause any detriment. Judge, we should win this debate for that reason. Thank you.
Would you mind sending the Civil War empiric about like only 5 had a civil war, and then your answers on agriculture?
Which do you want all answers on agriculture?
Yes.
Okay, I'll send you the entire case now. I can just copy paste it. Sending that email now.
I'll let y'all know when we get it, and then we'll run prep.
Cool. Should be sent right now. Have you guys gotten that yet? I think
Really quick question. Is the Vietnam example the only card you read on C2? Because I thought
for liberalization. Yeah, that's the card we read on C2.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're gonna start running prep. I'll tell y'all when I start the timer. Yeah.
Sorry, stop prep really quick. The first card that you read, is that your analysis, or is that the actual words of the author?
That is word for word what the article says. If you want to look at the, it's word for word. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
That was 1 minute and 30 seconds taken. I'm going to start, Judge, with defending the negative side and then going on to attacking the affirmative side. So starting our contention 1 about austerity. Is anybody not ready? We are clearly winning our austerity contention. Ambrose 20 finds that despite COVID, the IMF is still posing austerity programs that will reduce or freeze public spending. Courant 20 austerity tells you that austerity measures rely on privatization. They never tell you about privatization, which is really important because we tell you that IMF loans specifically are what increase privatization. It causes, first of all, social safety nets to decrease because Thoreau explains that 80% of IMF COVID loans push for cuts to public healthcare systems. And that's really bad because the World Bank quantifies that 36% of the poor escape poverty because of social safety nets. But the second reason is because it increases civil conflict, because the TOC tells you that IMF programs create economic grievances because they disproportionately hurt advantaged groups. They make a couple of responses. The first, that austerity doesn't exist during COVID. Unfortunately, our evidence tells you that at the very height of COVID, when the panic was real, they didn't enforce austerity, but now that the panic has subsided, they are back to enforcing austerity and will continue to do so in the long term, which is why you prefer our argument, because austerity will continue to happen in the long term. But then they try to tell you that austerity is only a short-term action. Maybe, but it has long-term consequences, like decking a country's ability to spend on social safety nets and also creating a civil conflict that lasts for years. But then they try to tell you that social spending increased. But unfortunately, they give you no warrant as to why that is. We give you the warrant because IMF austerity measures force countries to increase force countries to cut social spending. But then on the civil conflict, they tell you that only 5 out of 97 countries had a civil war. Their evidence is lying. It says only 5 in the same year. Overall, there have been much more civil conflicts. We isolate 2 specifically in Rwanda and Uganda, and we tell you that 30% of the countries in that region are still affected by IMF austerity measures. But then they tell you that improving government transparency is good for civil conflict. But unfortunately, they don't tell you how transparency solves for any type of civil conflict. Transparency doesn't mean anything, but we tell you that what does hurt is when people don't have enough food and start to rebel against the government. But then on our contention too about agriculture, you can cleanly extend it because we tell you that it leads to economic liberalization because 43% of IMF loan programs include food and agriculture conditions. This creates an economic crisis that leads to massive amounts of high prices for food. They just say that it stabilized, that liberalization stabilizes the economy. But first of all, none of their evidence talks specifically about agriculture. And second of all, we say that a growing economy doesn't solve for a surge in food prices that hurt the poorest, which is why you can cleanly extend that 7 million people are short on food and 690 million people were undernourished. That's the biggest reason that you should vote for the negative in this round. Now let's go on to their case. Their first contention is about, or they tell you to prefer the future, but you should look at a holistic view of everything the IMF has done. On their contention, when they talk about protecting investment, but unfortunately, IMF actually decreases foreign direct investment overall. In an empirical study of 68 countries over 3 decades, everything found that countries signing IMF agreements attract about 25% less of direct foreign investment. Also, we would tell you that it actually makes them less credible because when they know that they have the IMF to back them up, countries become more risky and take more risk. That's really bad because it increases the likelihood that they become a riskier investment. But on their contention too, we would actually tell you that austerity measures are happening right now in solving for COVID, which means that they were flexible at the peak of the crisis, but then went back. This hurts COVID solvency because now they aren't spending as much on healthcare. Also, Goodman tells you that the IMF has done nothing to remedy the effects of COVID in the global south, as the IMF vowed to spare poor countries from desperation, but have failed to translate their concern into meaningful support. In other words, the IMF is all bark and no bite. But then let's go to the contention 3. This is really important. All of their evidence just says that the IMF wants to do certain things. None of these climate policies have passed. In fact, I would tell you that if it did pass, it would be really bad because the IMF climate policy proposal would exacerbate inequality. As Arnoff writes, in the context of gaping inequality, any climate policy that doesn't look to make the economy more equal overall will be dead on arrival. The rich can't afford to adjust, the poor can't. And actually, they say that the IMF will increase green technology, which is specifically how they solve for climate. But unfortunately, green tech is inevitable. We will be investing in green tech no matter what. There's a litany of reasons. As Tucker 20 explains, that the green revolution is inevitable. Consumers not only want companies to be better, but they are also demanding more and more green products, which means as long as there's a demand for green tech, countries will create green tech regardless of if the IMF is involved or not. For these reasons, you should negate. Are you good for cross?
All good to go.
Hey, guys, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, I need to pause just for a second because I'm having some slight connectivity issues and I just want to make sure that I have it cleared up. I believe I caught everything on the rebuttals, but I'm having some slight connectivity issues. I just want to clean it up before summary and final focus. So can we just pause for a second while I get myself set up a little bit better?
If you feel like you missed anything in the rebuttal, just let me know and I can clarify.
Yeah. Please let us know. We can send you a case or explain it anyway.
Okay, thank you. I might need a little clarification because I actually got bumped for a little bit, but let me try to set up my internet first and then I can ask any questions. Thank you. I apologize.
And we won't take prep during this.
I'm actually going to move a little closer to my router to see if that helps. So you're going to see me move. Okay. Just so that I make sure that I have the Marist rebuttal.
Yes.
I went down right after, just for a few seconds, right after you were saying that there was no warrant on the social spending increases.
Sure.
So
Okay.
maybe if you could pick up just a little bit right after that, just to make sure that I caught anything. And I then picked up at the top of your rebuttal of their case. So I think
Okay,
I got all
perfect.
of that.
Okay, so after I said there's no warrant to why social spending increases, I went on to the Civil War conflict, and they said that we only 5 countries had a civil war, but their evidence actually says that only 5 in the same year had a civil war, where in reality the number of countries that have a civil war overall is a lot higher. And then just let me know when I can. And then the next argument, they tell you that it improves government transparency, but they don't tell you what government transparency actually does to decrease the civil conflict. Whereas we tell you that like austerity measures increase civilians' likelihood to rebel against the government.
Okay, good. I think that catches me up.
Well, did
All
you
right,
get
so
on
whenever
any
you guys are ready to go.
contention 2 on agriculture?
I did get that. I came back in
Okay.
on the agriculture, so
Okay,
I
awesome.
did. I think I'm okay with that.
Okay. Are you good for cross then?
We're all good to go. You
You
got
can have
first
the
question,
first
right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right. Judges ready? Good for cross, Judge? Okay, cool. All right, my time will begin now. You tell us again and again that the austerity creates civil conflict, citing Rwanda, citing Uganda. Is there any actual isolated economic study that actually shows that it is because precisely of the IMF that conflict happened? There are countless factors that actually cause genocide.
Yes. Okay. Here's the problem. You don't actually respond to either of our specific evidence about Rwanda. If I could just finish answering. You don't respond to either of our specific evidence about Rwanda or Uganda, and our evidence does isolate that austerity programs from the IMF specifically increase the likelihood of civil conflict, which is why you miss the warranting that when austerity measures happen, the government can't spend as much on its citizens and they revolt. That's what leads to a civil conflict. But can I have a question?
Sorry, just one quick follow-up. So are you stating that it is because of the IMF that the Rwandan genocide happened? Is that what you're stating in your case?
Our argument is not about the Rwandan genocide. It's about a Rwandan civil conflict. It's not the same thing.
Is there any actual civil conflict that happened in Rwanda that you can tell me about?
Yes, our evidence isolates 2. There's not a name of it. Like, it was a massive civil conflict in Rwanda that happened, and also another civil conflict that happened in Uganda. Can I have a question?
Sure, please go ahead.
All right, let's talk about let's talk about COVID solvency. You tell me that the IMF solves COVID because they're becoming more flexible, but to the point where our evidence post-states yours, as in it comes after and tells you that when COVID, like the panic of COVID subsided, the IMF went back to enforcing austerity. Where do we see long-term solvency happening for COVID in a world where a country has to decrease their healthcare spending to like abide by IMF conditions?
Perfect. Yeah, we tell you 2 things. First of all, that yes, austerity isn't happening within the IMF. And second, according to the most recent evidence, Gallagher et al. 2020, that the IMF is actually investing in inclusive growth policies, such as green tech and protection of vulnerable populations.
We're not talking about, wait, really quick. I understand that you say that during COVID, the IMF didn't enforce austerity. Our evidence comes after that and tells you that when the panic of COVID subsided, they did return to enforcing austerity and will continue to do it in the long term. We tell you
precisely that according to our evidence, short-term austerity does not affect long-term growth given through economic growth.
Really quick.
Sorry, can I answer?
Really quick. I just don't understand the warranting behind that, because just because austerity happens for a short period of time, if a country can't spend money anymore on their society, how does that not a long-term impact?
I can give you a super easy impact. Austerity is the tightening of fiscal policy, raising interest rates to decrease inflation. When inflation decreases, a country is poised to grow, according to economics, because of Keynesian economic theory, which is precisely why the economy will grow after austerity kicks in.
Unfortunately, IMF austerity enforces specific conditions that not only just decrease inflation. If I could just finish really quick. IMF policies don't just increase inflation or decrease inflation or change inflation. They enforce specific conditions that make a country have to cut spending, which is why empirically 43% of countries with IMF loans had to cut social spending, which is devastating during a pandemic.
Can you
that's
please?
cross.
We tell you the exact opposite
That's
evidence,
cross.
telling you that health spending is increasing. Thank you.
Are y'all running prep before summary?
Sunny, do you need prep?
Can I look at your card about like cutting spending? Like how much percent of like,
43%.
30, yeah, 33.
I misspoke. It was 80% of COVID loans pushed for cuts to public healthcare spending. Sydney's sending it right now.
Wait, sorry, just to clarify, there's no 43% evidence?
It's 80% of COVID loans pushed for cuts to public healthcare spending.
In your case earlier, I think you mentioned stuff about like in general health spending, 43% of all austerity, conditionality.
Sydney will send you like the numbers that we have.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
The 40% thing was safety nets lower inequality and reduce the poverty gap by 45%. Do you want that card?
Sorry, can you come again with that?
The 45% card says that safety nets reduce the poverty gap by 45%.
That's no need because that's not conditionality, right? Okay, thank you.
Okay, so then that link that I just sent, that's the one that leads into that next card. So
Okay, thank you so much.
you're welcome.
Okay. Everyone's ready. Yep. My time will start now. First, go over our case. Economic growth is the most direct result of the IMF programs. Our cut is the best evidence that evaluates the most sample sizes in today's debate. More than 900 studies over decades accounted for selection bias. We tell you that the IMF promoted economic growth, road GDP growth, which set the foundation for any kind of poverty alleviation. And we win on magnitude because the IMF directly benefits the poor. We saved 7 million out of poverty because of economic growth of just 1%. And we also alleviated relative poverty by reducing inequality. My parents never respond to the fact that we save millions of people and pull them out of the poverty. All of our evidence tells you that the IMF programs are empirically beneficial for the overall economy and for the poor. Now let's move to the second condition about coronavirus. Our Gallagher card evaluates the most recent IMF programs focusing on the pandemic, and it tells you the IMF is doing a successful job in transitioning away from austerity measures. And we partially save 90 million people every year. And now the third condition about climate change. Yes, IMF, decreasing climate change and changing to renewable energy is the trend. And IMF facilitated that trend by reduction in emissions by 80% by 2050 they never respond to that. They just concede to the fact that decreasing climate change is the trend. Now let's move on to their main arguments. First, about austerity. Okay, in the data set used by the very evidence Oxfam, the IMF COVID financing tracker, there's actually valid evidence to suggest that money going into social programs, like those responding to COVID-19 in many countries. A few quotes from the staff report. We also have the card. The government, quote, the government has also prepared a COVID-19 national response plan aimed at strengthening the medical response that includes the creation of a COVID-19 response team, end quote. Their card does not support the idea of decreasing social spending. Actually, in most of the cases, there's actually increasing spending in healthcare. And secondly, Judge, we ask you to prefer our Gallagher card because it evaluates more than 100 programs. That's more than programs they evaluate on their side. And it tells you that the IMF is transitioning away from austerity measures. And moreover, austerity is not required for all IMF programs. Most countries don't even have to cut spending. Chris Giles found in 2020 that countries that keep borrowing would not have to raise taxes or cut public spending plans. Even if it's true that IMF prompts cuts, these are only temporary. My partner has already told you that these cuts do not persist in the long term. And what the IMF does is that direct investment in the most effective ways. Now let's move on to their second argument about civil war. It is possible. Okay, if you look at the card, the last line directly says that it is possible that cuts in public goods help exacerbate an already tense situation. They never provide the uniqueness of like the IMF programs leading into civil conflicts. Well, they're arguing on their side is just like simply slope argument. The link does not exist on their side because there's little or no string attached to the IMF programs in the first place. IMF programs do not lead to these civil war conflicts. These conflicts exist because of other reasons. While Soysa card evaluates more than 97 events, and it tells you that only 5 events happen happen annually as like 5 civil war happened. And now let's move on to the arguments of liberalization. We tell you throughout Vietnam and Tunisia cards that they actually doesn't happen. Liberalization is already the trend, and liberalization actually has helped these countries by boosting their economy. Therefore, we strongly urge for a pro ballot.
Okay, so far we've used 130 of prep, and I'm gonna just start running the rest of that now. Okay, the order is going to be starting off on my case, and then I'm going to go on to my opponent's case. Oops, sorry, I'm just trying to pull up my document. Perfect. Is everyone ready? Okay. Judge, this round is extremely easy and negative ballot insofar as our opponents do not interact with anything that Claire said in her rebuttal. Let's start on our C1 on austerity. Cleanly extended. We tell you that the IMF austerity is enacting austerity measures in countries that is giving out its loans to during the pandemic. That's why we've seen that 80% of COVID loans came with austerity measures. This specific reason why this is bad is because IMF austerity leads to privatization, which specifically leads to our first link about cutting social safety nets. The problem is that when these safety nets are cut, it exacerbates exacerbates the amount of people who are no longer able to escape poverty with safety nets, and it increases the poverty gap by 45%. Not one time in the summary do you even hear the word social safety nets, because that link is conceded. If anything, we win 100% probability here because it's not interacted with. The only thing that our opponents say is that these cuts are temporary and don't persist in the long term, but we're telling you that these short-term cuts prevent long-term growth because people no longer can be mobilized due to social safety net programs. But Judge, the cleanest and most easiest place to vote in today's round is on our second contention on agriculture, insofar as the only response that they extend is over time, but it's only saying that liberalization boosts the economy. The problem is that they give you no warranting at all as to how liberalization boosts the economy. We give you the warranting why it specifically hurts countries, but empirically Zambia. That's why Sonkin explains that 43% of IMF loans programs include food and agricultural conditions that push for liberalization, reducing the role of the state in price support, insurance, etc., which is why Chowdhury finds that this has empirically led to the massive crisis and famine in Africa and Latin America. And without this IMF freeze on agriculture, producers would have achieved growth. But instead, we're seeing famine, which is why we've seen in Zambia empirically, specifically IMF agricultural liberalization programs led to 7 million people being short on food, and overall 690 million people are undernourished as a result of IMF. You're going to be winning this argument in three ways. We are the only team that's going to give you this weighing in the round, so it's clean vote for us. The first on magnitude, because it's 600 million people affected worldwide, directly affected by the famine, and the root cause is IMF. But second is on probability. We have 100% probability that IMF liberalization of agriculture led to 7 million people starving in Zambia. But the third is on the prereq, because famine should be evaluated first in this round, because economic growth literally is not attainable for people in poverty who cannot afford food. Let's go into their case. They go for everything but do not respond to anything Claire says. On their first contention about economic growth, extend the term that FDI decreases 25% in countries that have IMF loans. The reason is because that they take more risky investments because they know that they can fall back on the IMF. The problem is that this decreases investor confidence, which means that long-term economic growth cannot happen if investors are not investing into their economy. On COVID, they cold dropped that Goldman finds this year. The IMF is all talk, no actual action. The IMF did absolutely nothing to curb COVID. They don't even respond with this card. It's extremely good. Call for it if you don't believe it. But on climate change, they're never going to win here because one, the IMF didn't even pass their climate change policy. But two, we tell you that green tech investment is inevitable because countries are having a global push for it. Now there's no reason why the IMF is the reason why countries can't invest in green tech. Look to the US, we're doing it right now.
Just a few quick cards. First about, what was it? Zambia, and it's 7 million, and also that number about the 700 million.
Yes.
Both those cards, yeah.
Yep. Okay. So they're going to be sent back to back. First is Zambia, and then the impact, or Zambia is also the impact, but then we're just saying it's exacerbated with the 690 million people. Which
okay, if you could just provide those two with the link, yeah. Wait, sorry, just
Sure.
to make clear, you're saying Zambia approves 690 million? Is that? Sorry.
I'm so sorry. We're in like a conference room and people had walked in, so we had to figure that out. Sorry. Can you repeat?
Sorry. So you're saying that the Zambia point proves the 690 million, right? That's what your evidence is going to tell me?
The Zambia is 7 million. The next impact is how it's exacerbated right now because 690 million people are currently starving. Are y'all ready for cross?
Sorry, I just want to make clear the Zambia.
We can do that. We can ask this in cross. Like you can have first question.
Okay, please, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, all good?
Yeah.
They're just ready. Opponents ready. All right, starting now. On to our first question. Your evidence about undernourishment actually refers to the impacts of COVID, not the IMF. How can we believe that your 690 million number even refers in any case to this topic?
Two responses. The first is that this is brand new response in Grand Cross. It shouldn't be evaluated because it wasn't in a speech, and final focus is way too late to respond. The second is that the card, if I can finish, please. No, if I can finish, if I could please just answer the question. If I could answer the question, thanks. The second response is that the card says that COVID exacerbates the famine crisis. which has nothing to do with saying that the IMF does not cause famine. Insofar as agricultural liberalization specifically, the only response that was tried to be extended was that liberalization is good, but agricultural liberalization specifically was never responded to, and we're saying that the IMF is the root cause of that, which is already going to exacerbate the crisis in the status quo.
Our rebuttal summary, our cases about Vietnam and Tunisia specifically refers to as private ownership over.
The problem is that Vietnam was not mentioned at all in summary, and Claire responded to it in rebuttal, and that was not responded to in summary.
I just want to ask one quick thing. Is there anything in that 690 million card that even mentions agricultural liberalization? Is there anywhere in that card?
It's about people dying because they're undernourished because they don't have food. The link to them not having food.
Agricultural liberalization anywhere in the card? It's just a yes or no question.
If we could get one word in edgewise, we could answer your questions much better.
The link to undernourishment is because the IMF comes into these countries. They pass structural adjustment programs which push for agricultural liberalization. The problem is that increases the prices of goods because it pushes out states from controlling the agricultural sector to corporations controlling it. They increase prices. People cannot afford food, which is why we see that malnourishment is increasing. Our impact, about 90 million people, is saying that the IMF specifically is exacerbating the crisis that's already existing. But even if you don't buy the 690 million, we give you the empiric on Zambia, which directly says that the IMF agricultural liberalization led to 7 million people being short on food. Can I get a question?
Please go ahead.
Thank you. On economic growth, why does economic growth matter, or how do we know that economic growth is going to be a long-term impact if investors reduce their investment by 25% because they feel like these countries that they would be investing in are taking riskier loans?
We'll clarify. Your only evidence about foreign direct investment doesn't even refer to our argument or our word on economic growth. We tell you growth happens for two reasons. First, conditionality, which actually creates advice conditions for growth. And second, it stabilizes economic crisis. In no point do we actually mention foreign direct investment, even though we have cards that actually prove to you. Sorry, can I please answer?
Go for it.
Yeah. In no part of our case do we actually mention FDI, but if we want to, we can also argue it benefits. But
your
warrants,
case says investment. Your case links is investment.
We never say foreign investment. We never mention FDI. Yeah, Judge, can I run the last, is it a minute and a half, my prep? Sonny, you ran a minute and a half, right? Okay, cool. I'll start my minute and a half now. All right. Judges ready? Opponents ready for the final focus? All right. My time will begin now. Now, Judge, your vote in this debate should be hinged on one thing: economic growth versus austerity, because this is the argument that all sides have collapsed on. Judge, they tell you a few things first. One, that austerity occurs during COVID, a piece of evidence that isn't as convincing as our two studies of Gallagher and Brookings, which both tell you it isn't happening. But even if you believe the evidence, they give no warrant as to why. We tell you in contrast that the IMF has reformed to increase social spending and econ growth through an inclusive growth model ever since the 1990s poverty reduction and growth trust. That is our empirical warrant. We win on that warrant. And judge, secondly, on an impact. Their impact on austerity doesn't even tell you how much potential people they can save. They only tell you that safety nets help people. This isn't enough to prove that the IMF conditionality will eliminate safety nets or it has reverse causation or causal. Judge, we don't even mention safety nets because their card doesn't even say the IMF. Why should we mention a card that doesn't even relate to our topic? Now, Judge, in contrast, we tell you why we should win. Because the IMF directly reduces poverty and decreases inequality, according to Clemens et al. And Hackler, which directly state the word IMF and decrease poverty and inequality, as stated in our meta-analysis itself. In fact, they never question our evidence about economic growth, which says in 80 years, there has been an increase every single year based on the largest meta-analysis in the history of this planet. We save 7 million lives and reduce inequality by 18%. Judge, their only piece of strong impact is their 690 million, which if you actually look at their card, is so off topic. It talks about how COVID creates famine. It doesn't mention agriculture, doesn't mention liberalization, doesn't mention privatization, no austerity. It has no link to this case at all, and it is so bad that it should not be even considered into this case. Judge, in contrast, we tell you from Vietnam, we brought 60 million people out of poverty. Even if we agree with Zambia, we outweigh by over 53 million. Judge, we win this debate not only on the considerability and reliability of our evidence, but also on impact, because we tell you directly, the IMF saves hundreds of millions of lives while they give you no clear link or impact. Thank you.
Okay, is everybody ready? It's going to start with the negative side and then go to the affirmative side. Is anybody not ready? Okay. This is a very easy negative ballot. You can first sign your ballot on austerity. We tell you that austerity is enacted even during the pandemic. Yes, at the height of the pandemic, maybe austerity was momentarily stopped, but our evidence tells you that after that panic subsided, the IMF went right back to enforcing conditions, which is why 80% of COVID loans came with austerity. That's really important because we tell you that those specific COVID loans forced spending cuts specifically for social spending, which will decrease poverty or which will increase the poverty gap by 45%. They can see the fact that austerity happens. They just say that it's short term. We tell you that the effects of those spending cuts that happen in the short term are very, very long term. But where you're really going to want to sign your ballot on is on our contention 2 about agriculture. It goes functionally conceded throughout the entire round. We give you 3 reasons to prefer our case, even if every other argument is a wash to you. They give you no reasons to prefer theirs. We tell you that, first of all, this outweighs on magnitude because we tell you that 690 million people are suffering from food insecurity. And second of all, Zambia specifically saw a 7 million increase in people who couldn't afford food, specifically because of the IMF. But second of all, on probability, because you know for a fact that this harm is happening right now, it's incredibly probable. But third is because you prioritize it first, simply because you prioritize it first because if people can't afford food, no economic growth happens. Our link is very simple. We tell you that 43% of IMF loan programs include food and agriculture conditions, which push for liberalization. This reduces the role of the state in price support, and that leads to massive crisis and famine in Africa and Latin America. Basically, food prices skyrocket, which is what causes our 7 million impact in Zambia and 690 people total can't afford food. The reason they can't afford food is because of the IMF. That has gone conceded. You are going to prefer this over everything else. Even if you buy their whole case, they don't tell you why to prefer it. We do. That's where we're going to be winning. But then they drop both of their second and third contentions and they just go for protecting the economy. But first of all, they don't extend a link, warrant, or impact. They just say that the IMF helps the economy. We give you the warranting about why it doesn't, because actually it decreases investment in the economies long term because countries begin to take risky investments knowing that the IMF will back them up. That's really important. We tell you that also, this is a long-term issue because the more that investment goes down, the less a country can economically grow. But regardless, they don't tell you why to prefer it over the 690 million people who can't afford food. This outweighs on magnitude, probability, and you prioritize it first because it happens way before the economy. For these reasons, it's a very, very clear neg ballot.
Great round, y'all. And thank you so much for judging.
Really good job. Thank you, Judge.
Yeah, thank you both. It was a great round. If you give me a few minutes, I will put in my ballot and then I'll come back to disclose.
Sure. Thanks so much.
Okay. Yep.
Hey guys, you guys are from the US? What state are you guys from?
Georgia.
Oh, cool. Is this your first TOC?
Yes.
Ours too. We're from China, so we're the only Chinese team.
I noticed. It's so cool.
Yeah, we're the only Chinese team in the gold division, which is fun. You guys did like multiple like state based and like national based to get in, right? Is that how it works?
Yeah, you have to have at least 2 national ones. Yeah, at national tournaments. Yeah, you have to get bid at least 2 national tournaments to qualify.
Oh wow, cool. Yeah, I think we came through our Chinese national TOC. Yeah, so if you place, I think top 3 gets gold to gold.
Okay.
Yeah, it's definitely different. I like this style more. In China, it's a little more like everyone's just like, give me your evidence, you give me your evidence, and we just have like a whole like evidence fight. But yeah, I like that we go into warrants and wins. Do you guys know how many teams break during this tournament? Is it 16?
I don't know. I think it breaks to like runoffs, but
yeah,
I don't know. Like
only 16, right? Because there's 120 teams.
Yeah, we'll see, I guess.
Yeah. Do you guys know when the next round is?
Let me check. Pairings come out for round 2 at 12 o'clock.
12 o'clock. Okay, that's pretty soon. They don't do like flight A, flight B here, right? Okay.
No, they're all single flighted.
All right, cool.
Okay, guys, thanks for the wait. I found for Marist VL on the neg ballot, the austerity that it kind of came down to me to austerity and agricultural liberalization. I think the austerity argument got a little muddied. So I actually didn't find on that. I think if I would have been forced to find on it, I would have found for con on this, because I believe they still had access to their impacts based on the long-term effects, even if austerity was short-term, because that went conceded by the pro. However, I actually think it was easier to find based on agricultural liberalization, which basically went pretty much unresponded to in summary. It really was at time. I think that the word liberalization got out of Con's mouth, but there wasn't really time on the clock to expand on it. And in Final Focus, the response was really about the card, and I had trouble looking at that since it hadn't been brought up in summary. So normally if that had been brought up in summary, I would have called for the card just to take a look at it. But since it didn't really get brought up into Final Focus, I really felt that it would be judge intervention to take a look at the card at that point. So I found based on Con's argument about agricultural liberalization and it causing famine and 698 undernourished in magnitude and probability. So that was it. And I wish you both, I thought it was a great round. I really enjoyed it. And I wish you both with all luck as you move forward in the competition.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so much. Great round, y'all.
Great
Thank you.
round, y'all.